Hello, my name is Jennifer Wellock. I'm the Technical Reviewer for the State, Tribal, Local Plans and Grants Division. I'm going to be talking to you about the review and compliance components of your project grant. So when you get a project grant with us, if you look through your grant agreement, you'll see there are several times we talk about environmental review as a condition of the grant agreement. And what I'm going to talk about with you are the National Historic Preservation Act 1966, which discusses Section 106 review, and also the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, which we discuss as NEPA. That's our shorthand. There's going to be other environmental laws that are the responsibility of our agency. What you need to understand as a grantee is that the action of giving you a grant triggers the responsibility upon us, the federal agency, in this case, the National Park Service. But we do need some help sometimes in figuring out all the details and making sure we do our due diligence. So we'll need your help as we go through the process. So to talk about the National Historic Preservation Act, this is the United States policy on historic preservation. It's intended to protect and preserve our historic and archaeological sites throughout the nation and our territories. If you read the preamble, I don't know if you'd be interested, but if should you be, you'll see that there are several intents of the law. The bins I point out here are it's meant to stop the loss of historic properties. It's intended to give an orientation to the American people by showing them their history and allowing them to participate in it. And it recognizes that government can't do it alone, that we need individuals that do the good, hard, difficult work of preservation, and we need our partners to help us in kind of fulfilling our mission of saving what we can and making sure that we document what we're doing. Your funding under this grant program was actually established by this law. If you take a look at it, so the Historic Preservation Fund was established under this law, and that's where your financial assistance is coming from. So we're going to look at the steps to Section 106. So you understand, inside the National Historic Preservation Act, there is a section, which is 106, which describes what the federal agency must do to make sure that their actions will have no negative effects to historic properties. So here you have, under this act, the Congress is establishing a comprehensive program. It's looking at everything, and they realize that there's federal agencies that will be impacting the environment, and they want to make sure that preservation is a crucial part of any program that is giving money or funding or licensing to make sure that there's some thoughtful understanding of the impacts. So Section 106 requires federal agencies to consider effects on historic properties in any project they carry out, and this can be assistance, permitting, licensing, or even just funding like we're doing here, and we call those undertakings. So we also, as a federal agency, the Park Service must also work with the National Advisor on Preservation, which is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and they have to give them, that group, a reasonable opportunity to comment if they perhaps are concerned about the project or if we are working through some work together. So the Advisory Council, in partnership with the agencies, created a procedure and process, and you can find that under 36 CFR Part 800. It's called the Protection of Historic Properties, and it lays out the steps. So it talks about all the people who are involved, all the different ways to go about discovery, and what should and must happen under the law. For us at the Park Service, because many of our projects are involved with historic properties, we're particularly concerned about this law. And we work hard and do our due diligence to make sure we follow all the steps. So when any federal agency that is funding a property or licensing a project, you have to determine first what exactly is the project area, and will there be anything in that area that's affected by the project. Inside that area, you have to figure out whether or not there's anything historic. The definition of historical properties are those that are listed in or are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Properties. So that can be an object, a site, a structure, a historic district, and just a building. And then you have to discuss whether or not there's a positive effect or a negative effect. So let's say, for instance, your grant project is re-roofing a historic property. So we know that the project area is going to impact a historic building. And we know that, for instance, we know that project area could be limited to just the roofing area of the building, just that area. But what if you're in a historic district or you're inside a historic park? Maybe we need to expand the area to include your neighbors. So we'd have to really kind of define the area, and we may need your help as the grantee to give us some feedback on where you're located. Then we're going to have to decide if the work we're doing will have a positive or a negative effect. So if we're going to do re-roofing, are we going to do it in a historic manner, or are we going to use a new material that might not be as positive for the historic resource? So we're going to try to explore measures as the federal agency that can be taken to avoid any negative impacts or adverse effects to historic properties. The way that we talk about this is, from us in the preservation, we have to work to meet the Secretary's standards. And I'm going to get into that in the next slide. But we also have to figure out, maybe we don't know everything about the project. So we need to figure out who are those interested parties. And we're going to probably ask you as the grantee to help us on that. Because while we know that every state historic preservation office and every tribal historic preservation may have some interest in our grant funding, there may be others in your local community that know even more about the importance of the property, or whether or not it's historic, or what the aspects of that significance for being historic are. So for instance, the law really came about, the Preservation Act, because folks were working with their mission. Federal agencies were funding projects based on their mission, but maybe not looking at all the impacts they would have. So we're going to have to go out to the community, to tribal, perhaps, leaders, to other folks that might have an interest, and ask them, do you have anything to add to this process? Because we admit we don't know everything, and we can't know everything. Even a grantee who has the best interest in the project may not understand all the aspects and the deep history of the site. So we want to make sure that we don't forget to include the public when we work on a project. The Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties are actually inside the Historic Preservation Act. The Act said somebody has to set some standards for what preservation should be, and the Department of the Interior was tasked with that. If you take a look at 36 CFR Part 68, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, it actually lists the 4 treatment standards, which are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. I've crossed out reconstruction here because our programs do not fund it. So we only deal with 3. So that's not so bad. And in general, these are philosophies of how to treat projects. And they are the best, the way we see them as the best possible outcome for historic preservation. So we're looking to do no harm, if you would. And the standards will apply to all grant and aid projects assisted with historic preservation funding. So you have to understand we're limited. We have to work with those. And it's one of the ways we can decide whether or not our funding will have an adverse effect under the rubric of the Section 106 steps. So say, for instance, we go back to that roofing project. Say the roofing project was slate, but you wanted to go with a solar panel. It might work. We'd have to take a look at what it would do, and we'd want to talk about whether or not the historic material could be bought easily. Can we get it today? Is it something that's available? Can we get it in a similar form? Are there substitute materials that would work? So we have to follow the guidance. If you're doing a rehabilitation project, we can look at maybe doing a new material. If you're doing a restoration project and we go back to those standards, we might have to go exactly in kind just to get you to a restoration level project. And certainly we can still get slate. So that's one of the things that we are happy to look at. And it's how we decide whether or not it's an adverse effect or a positive effect. So if you take a look at the regulations, once we know that it's an adverse effect, the federal agency has to figure out a way to avoid that effect. I mean, it's our at the Park Service, many of our grant programs, we are not allowed to actually fund things that will create adverse effects. So we're particularly concerned. Other agencies may not be as concerned because they have a different mission. And so in their cases, when they come across something that might actually negatively impact a historic property, they will have to work with the state historic preservation officer or the tribal historic preservation officer to kind of craft a way to mitigate that negative effect. And that's how they worked with a memorandum of agreement, and they work together. If they can't come to an agreement, they will have to go to the arbiter, which is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So we'll get back to how this works with your grant agreement later, but I did want to give you a background on that. Now let's look at the National Environmental Policy Act. This is passed after the Historic Preservation Act, but it has some of the same goals. It established our policies for the country on environmental goals, but it talks about the human environment and the physical environment. So we're looking for not just nature only, but how humans interact with nature. And you can find their regulations in 40 CFR 1500 to 1508. And that discusses their equivalent, I guess, of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation would be the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ. Just like the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106, the National Environmental Policy Act, which I'm going to call NEPA from now on, is triggered by federal action. So federal actions are defined in much the same way. Anything funded in whole or in part under the direct or indirect jurisdiction of the federal agency, including actions carried out by or on behalf of the federal agency. So same thing, anything licensed, funded, permitted, approved. So just so you understand, your act, the grant, again, will trigger this law. The National Environmental Policy Act and the National Historic Preservation Act aren't the only laws we worry about. The National Historic Preservation Act is actually covered in NEPA as well, and so are the Endangered Species Act. Sometimes we have executive orders. I put two here that we often deal with, executive orders on environmental justice, and we have things about Indian trust resources. So we are, as the federal agency, it's our responsibility. This is on us. You are our partner in that you're helping us to fulfill our obligation, and our action of the grant to you has triggered this procedure, but it is in our court. And so we ask you to build in some time frames, and that's what I'm going to go over. We're going to need your help. So the environmental screening worksheet is sort of our way of handling this because we don't know everything that you know. Perhaps you've worked with another funding agency, and we would like to know that because maybe you've already done many of the portions of these laws. Maybe you've done parts of them already. And for instance, say you receive grant funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in the CDBG program, which is the Community Development Block Grant Program. If you've gotten project work through them, you may have already worked with your state historic preservation officer or your tribal historic preservation officer to determine effects and to discuss them. So our screening worksheet would ask you to put in the project information, describe the project, give us any background you have on previous work you've done for Section 106 or for NEPA, and then you'll go through a checklist of the mandatory criteria for kind of evaluating a project. If you have anything in there that triggers the do not pass go section, I would say, where it says, oh no, wait, this project is going to adversely impact the environment, we're going to have to slow down and maybe redesign the project or discuss it with you and see if we really understand what we're funding. Most people think of construction as something that would trigger the NEPA or Section 106, but all project types will trigger it because we're funding all. We are probably going to look at archaeology very strictly, and we're also going to look at other work that you might not initially think of as having impacts. But we're here to make sure that we all, cross our T's and dot our I's. And when you go through the worksheet, don't get overwhelmed. Just focus on the scope of your particular project. You're not trying to assess the world. One of the questions is about, will this impact minority communities? And you may not know the answer to that. If we're funding a roof project, it's unlikely. If we're funding 35 roof projects, maybe. So we'll have to talk, and we'll be happy to answer questions about any of these as you go through. And here's where I was going to talk about the length of time that this requires. You've already had to deal with setting up the grant agreement. You've already applied, I should say, and you've done the hard work there. You've gotten accepted, and funds have been awarded to you. So now you're ready to go. And sometimes you're very far behind, and you really want to get started quickly. And I'm here to tell you that you need to take a breath, because there's a lot to do, and there's a lot of steps to cover. And you put us, the Park Service, at risk if you move too fast. So once you receive your grant, you've worked with your grant manager on the scope of work, and you've got all your tasks laid out in this very long grant agreement. I suggest reading it closely and thinking about all the steps that are going to have to be checked off, all the conditions of that grant funding. As you begin your procurement process, you may be tempted to go ahead and start to execute contracts right away. But what if you need help? For instance, what if you are using an architect to design something and you suddenly realize, oh, I still have to send this in for review on the Section 106 process and the NEPA process. Wait a minute, I've already told him to begin. That can add some time and some penalty to your scope and to your contracts. So begin the review, the Section 106 review process with our office as soon as you really understand your project and as soon as you begin your procurement, because you want to make sure if you're going to procure services that you actually have a full scope of work. Maybe you need the architect to work with you on your submissions for review. Maybe you, before you do the contract, you might find out that as we work with the State Historic Preservation Office, when we submit our determination of effect for that particular roof project you're doing, I'm going to use that one again, what if the State Historic Preservation Office comes back and says, you talked about doing some substitute materials, but we're not really sure how they're going to look. Can we see a mock-up? So now you've got to stop work and get a mock-up in place. But if you'd worked with us before, you could put the mock-ups into the contract, or you could establish some time in there for potential review issues that might arise. In some cases, we will work with you throughout a project for phasing, because perhaps there's an archaeological component that we need to do before we can do the construction, or there's a study that we need to have done before we can say what's the best treatment. So there may be multiple times when we have to check back in with each other. When you do the complete project and you do your final report, you're finished, hooray, everything looks amazing, you're very proud of the work, you'll send it in to us, and just to let you know, we will then send it back to those partners we identified early in the review process, and we'll make sure that they get notification. The work was done as we all agreed. The work is complete. And so we'll close that loop at the very end. Now, you may have some need to look at the actual things I've been talking about, which I understand it's complicated. So take a look at some of these links here that I've put at the end of the PowerPoint. The standards are there. The archaeological documentation standards are there. At the Park Service, we have a group called Technical Preservation Services, and they produce briefs, and those are the recommended methods and approaches for rehabilitation for historic properties. Those are very helpful if you're doing construction or if you're doing identification, because they will give you an idea of one is about character defining features, another might be about Adobe, another might be about how to clean brick. So you want to take a look at that series. It's very helpful. And you can actually build that into some of your contracts in making sure that those who are doing the work are familiar with that recommended method. Therefore, they will automatically have no adverse effect because they will be meeting the treatment standards. So you see how it's all linked together. The Citizens Guide to Section 106 is an advisory council page, and that will give you the regulations and also where a citizen can insert themselves in the process. This is helpful for you as the grantee to understand there may be folks who have a voice in this and they need to be asked to the table. The NEPA review process, this is a link to a site that discusses sort of how it's supposed to work. And again, it's about identification, about a project area, about an assessment of impacts. The State Historic Preservation Office link here will get you to a list of all the offices in the country and in our territories. The Uniform Administration Requirements discusses things that are necessary for federal awards. And of course, our grant manual has a section, Chapter 16, that deals with environmental compliance, but all of our information can be found there, as well as our webpage, which has our worksheet and our other reporting requirements. So I hope this has been helpful. Again, if you have any questions, always contact your grant manager, and we look forward to working with you on your important project. Thank you.